People like her don't belong in conversations. The words landed flat and cold against the polished wood of the private dining table, and for a second, even the low hum of the restaurant seemed to pull back and disappear as Ava Johnson stood just behind Daniel Whitmore's chair, a silver tray balanced in her hands, the faint clink of crystal glasses the only sound that dared move in the silence, her reflection trembling in the dark wine as she set it down with practiced precision, invisible. Or at least that's what he intended, because Daniel Whitmore never looked at people like her, not when million-dollar contracts were spread open beneath warm chandelier light, not when men in tailored suits leaned forward with quiet smiles and polished confidence, not when a $200 million deal sat waiting for his signature, his pen already uncapped between his fingers, hovering just inches above the page as legal jargon curled across thick paper like something alive, something dangerous, though no one at the table seemed to notice. Or maybe they chose not to, because power had a way of muting doubt, and Daniel wore power like a second skin, calm, controlled, certain, the kind of certainty that made people stop asking questions, the kind that turned a room full of executives into silent agreement, nods exchanged, glances aligned, everything moving forward exactly as planned, except for one small detail, one line buried deep in the contract that Ava had caught in passing. Just a flicker of words as she poured water moments ago, something about liability, something about transfer, something that didn't sit right in the quiet part of her mind that never stopped working, even when she was supposed to just serve and disappear, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the tray as the air grew heavier, the scent of expensive cologne and aged bourbon mixing with something sharper, something tense, and still Daniel didn't see her, didn't acknowledge her, didn't consider for even a second that the person standing 3 feet behind him might understand exactly what he was about to sign, because to him she was just a waitress, just another background detail in a room built for people like him, people who believed control was absolute, that nothing unexpected could slip through, and yet Ava stayed, just a second longer than she should have, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the contract, the faint rustle of paper as one of the lawyers adjusted a page, the quiet scrape of a chair, the subtle shift of weight in a room that was seconds away from sealing something irreversible, and still no one noticed her hesitation. No one saw the calculation behind her calm expression, until the moment stretched just a little too far, until silence itself seemed to lean in, waiting, and somewhere between the weight of the pen and the final breath before ink touched paper, Ava made a choice she wasn't supposed to make. The pen did not move, not yet, and in that fragile pause Ava felt the weight of every second stretching thin as glass, her heart steady but loud in her ears, louder than the low murmur of executives, louder than the distant clatter of dishes beyond the closed doors, because she knew she should step away, she knew the rules: serve, smile, disappear, do not interrupt, do not exist beyond the edges of the table. But the words on that page would not leave her mind. They stayed there, sharp and clear, like something she had studied once, something she had understood too well to ignore, and she could almost hear her old professor's voice in the back of her thoughts, slow and precise, explaining how liability could be hidden in plain sight, how one misplaced clause could shift everything, not just money, but responsibility, reputation, futures, and now it was right there in front of her, disguised beneath polished language and confident signatures, waiting for someone to overlook it, waiting for someone powerful enough to believe they could not be wrong. Ava's grip on the tray loosened just slightly as she lowered it onto the empty edge of the table, the cool surface grounding her for a brief second, her gaze flicking once more to the contract, page numbers aligned neatly at the bottom, 17 sitting quietly among them like it did not matter, like it was just another page, and still no one spoke about it, no one questioned it, because why would they? This was Daniel Whitmore's table, his deal, his control, and control had a way of silencing doubt before it could even form. One of the attorneys leaned in closer, pointing at a paragraph near the end, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Everything is structured to protect your interests, Mr. Whitmore. And Daniel gave a small nod, the kind that ended conversations before they began, his fingers adjusting the pen slightly, aligning it with the signature line as if precision alone could guarantee certainty. Ava felt something tighten in her chest then, not fear exactly, but something heavier, something closer to responsibility, because she had seen what happened when people signed things they did not fully understand. She had watched it unravel lives from the inside out, quietly at first, then all at once. And she had promised herself she would never be the kind of person who stayed silent when she knew better, even if silence was safer, even if speaking meant stepping out of place. Her breath slowed, deliberate now, as she straightened her posture just slightly, the movement small enough that no one noticed, or maybe they noticed and chose not to care, because in a room like this, attention was currency, and she did not have any to spend. One of the men across the table chuckled softly at something unrelated, a casual ease settling over the group again, as if the deal was already done, as if the outcome had already been decided, and Daniel's pen lowered just a fraction closer to the paper, close enough that the tip nearly touched, close enough that the moment felt irreversible, and that was when Ava realized that if she walked away now, if she let this happen, she would carry that silence with her long after this night ended, long after the lights dimmed and the table was cleared. It would follow her, quiet but constant, a reminder that she had known and said nothing, and that thought alone was enough to stop her from taking the step back she was supposed to take. Instead she remained exactly where she was, just behind his shoulder, just outside his world, and yet closer to the truth than anyone else in the room. The tip of the pen hovered so close to the paper that even the slightest movement would seal it, and Daniel Whitmore's expression remained unchanged, calm and controlled, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this moment, his attention fixed on the signature line, not on the room, not on the people, and certainly not on the woman standing just behind him. But something shifted then, something subtle, almost invisible, because Ava did not step back. She did not disappear like she was supposed to. Instead she leaned forward just enough for her voice to exist in the space between certainty and consequence. "Sir," she said, quiet but clear, and the single word alone was enough to break the rhythm of the room. A few heads turning, a pause settling over the table like a breath held too long, Daniel's hand stopping mid-motion, not out of respect, but irritation, his eyes lifting slowly, not fully turning yet, just enough to acknowledge an interruption he had not permitted, the kind of interruption that did not belong in his world. One of the executives shifted in his seat, another let out a faint, awkward exhale, and the attorney nearest the contract frowned slightly, already anticipating the need to move things forward again, to restore control, because control was everything here, and Ava had just stepped outside of it, but she did not rush, did not stumble over her words. Her voice remained steady, grounded in something deeper than confidence, something closer to truth. "Before you sign," she continued, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the document itself, "you might want to look at page 17, and that was when the tension sharpened, not loud, not explosive, but precise, like a line drawn where it was not supposed to be. Daniel turned his head fully now, his eyes landing on her for the first time, really seeing her, not as a blur, not as background, but as a presence, and there was no warmth in that look, only measured annoyance, the kind that expected silence in return. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, controlled, the room tightening around it, a quiet reminder of hierarchy, of who spoke and who did not. A soft chuckle came from one end of the table, quickly suppressed, while the manager near the doorway stiffened, already preparing to intervene, to correct this breach before it went any further. But Ava did not step back, did not apologize. She simply met the moment with the same calm she had held since she first noticed the clause, the liability transfer. She said, just enough detail to anchor her words in something real, something specific. "It does not protect your company the way it looks." And now the silence deepened, no longer dismissive, but uncertain, because even the smallest hint of doubt had a way of spreading when it touched the right place. The attorney closest to Daniel glanced down at the contract instinctively, fingers brushing the edge of the page as if confirming something he had already read, already approved, already believed was correct. Daniel's expression did not change, but his pen lifted slightly away from the paper, just enough to pause what had felt inevitable seconds before, and in that pause, Ava stood completely still, not pushing further, not raising her voice, simply allowing the weight of what she had said to exist on its own, unforced, undeniable, and for the first time since the meeting began, the certainty in the room began to crack, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. The silence did not break all at once, it tightened first, like something pulling inward, and then Daniel Whitmore's expression hardened just slightly, not in confusion, not yet, but in controlled resistance, because people did not interrupt him, not in rooms like this, not during moments like this. His fingers slowly placing the pen down beside the contract with deliberate precision, as if even that movement was a statement, his gaze locking onto Ava now with full attention, cold and measured. "You are out of line," he said, his voice quiet but firm enough to carry across the table without effort. And that was all it took for the balance in the room to shift back toward him. A few subtle nods from the executives, a faint release of tension as if order had been restored, the attorney nearest him clearing his throat softly, ready to continue, to dismiss the interruption as nothing more than background noise. But Ava did not step back, did not apologize. Her posture remained steady, her hands now empty at her sides, the tray forgotten, because this moment had already moved beyond service, beyond roles, beyond what she was supposed to be. "I am not trying to overstep," she said, her tone even, respectful but unwavering. "I am trying to make sure you see what is actually there." And that word, actually, lingered longer than expected, not loud, not emphasized, but precise enough to land. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, because confidence recognized something different when it appeared, something that did not belong to fear or impulse. One of the men across the table shifted uncomfortably, glancing again at the contract, his fingers tapping once against the paper before stopping, uncertainty beginning to surface in places it should not. The manager near the door took a step forward, hesitating, unsure whether to intervene or wait, because something about the moment had changed. It was no longer just a disruption, it was a question, and questions in rooms like this were dangerous. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, creating space between himself and the contract, between decision and action. "Then explain it," he said finally, not as permission, but as a challenge, his voice steady, controlled, inviting her to justify the breach she had created. And every eye in the room turned to Ava now, not with respect, not yet, but with curiosity sharpened by tension, because she had crossed a line that most people would never dare approach, and now she had to stand in it. Ava inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the quiet details around her, the reflection of light across the glassware, the faint ticking of a watch somewhere at the table, the weight of expectation pressing in from every side. But she did not rush. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. Instead, she reached forward just enough to indicate the contract without touching it, her finger hovering above the page as if even that distance mattered. "The clause on page 17, she said, her voice steady. "It is written to look like protection, but it shifts full responsibility to your company if anything goes wrong after the deal closes." The attorney's posture stiffened almost immediately, his hand moving to the page before she even finished speaking, flipping to the section in question with a quick, practice motion, his eyes scanning faster now, not casually, not confidently, but searching. And that subtle change did not go unnoticed, not by Daniel, not by anyone. Ava continued. "Not louder, not faster, just clearer. If there is a dispute, or a failure, or any legal issue tied to the merger, it does not stay shared." She paused just enough for the weight of it to settle. "It becomes entirely yours." And this time the silence that followed was different, no longer dismissive, no longer controlled, but uncertain, alive, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something no one had expected to move. And for the first time since the pen had hovered above the page, the deal no longer felt inevitable. The attorney's eyes did not move the way they had before, not with casual confidence, but with sharp, deliberate focus as he scanned the lines again, slower this time, his finger tracing the clause as if seeing it for the first time. And the shift was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening in his jaw, a pause that lasted just a fraction too long, and that fraction was enough for the room to feel it, the uncertainty spreading quietly from one end of the table to the other. Daniel Whitmore watched him without speaking, his gaze steady, measuring, waiting, because now it was no longer about a waitress interrupting, it was about whether she was right, and that question carried weight, real weight, the kind that could not be dismissed with a glance or a word. "It is standard language," another executive said quickly, too quickly, leaning forward as if to regain control of the narrative, his tone confident but strained at the edges. "These agreements always include protective clauses." But the attorney did not respond, not immediately, his silence louder than any reassurance, his eyes still locked on the page. And then he shifted, just slightly, sitting back a fraction as if creating distance from the document itself. "It is structured differently," he admitted, his voice careful now, no longer smooth, no longer absolute, and that single hesitation landed heavier than any accusation. Daniel's fingers pressed lightly against the table, a slow, controlled movement, grounding himself as the certainty he had walked in with began to fracture, not completely, not yet, but enough to demand attention. "Explain," he said, his tone sharper now, directed not at Ava, but at the man he had trusted to protect him from exactly this kind of risk. The attorney adjusted his glasses, flipping back a page, then forward again, cross-referencing, recalculating, and the room leaned in without meaning to, drawn by the shift in authority, because when the person responsible for certainty hesitated, everything else followed. "If there is a dispute tied to post-merger performance," the attorney began slowly, choosing each word with precision, "the Liability does not remain shared between both parties as initially implied. He paused, glancing once more at the clause as if confirming what he was about to say. It consolidates under Whitmore Holdings, and the word settled into the room like weight, undeniable, heavy, real. One of the executives exhaled sharply, another leaned back in his chair, the confidence from moments ago slipping into something quieter, something more cautious. Daniel did not react immediately, his expression remaining controlled, but his eyes had changed, the calm certainty replaced by calculation, deeper now, sharper, because this was no longer theoretical, no longer abstract. This was a risk, a real one, and he had come within seconds of signing it. His gaze shifted slowly, deliberately, back to Ava, and this time there was no dismissal in it, no irritation, only a quiet, focused intensity, as if re-evaluating everything he thought he understood about the moment, about her, about the assumption he had made without question. Ava did not move, did not speak further. She had said what needed to be said, and now the truth was doing its own work, unfolding without her. The manager near the door lowered his gaze, uncertain now, unsure of his place in a situation that had moved beyond control. The executives avoided looking directly at each other, each processing the shift in silence, and at the center of it all, the contract remained open on the table, unchanged, but no longer harmless, no longer invisible, and the pen that had hovered so close to sealing it now rested untouched. A small object that suddenly carried the weight of everything that had almost gone wrong. No one reached for the pen anymore, and that absence of movement carried more weight than any argument could have. The room no longer guided by confidence but held in place by something quieter, something heavier, the kind of silence that forces people to sit with what they almost did. Daniel Whitmore leaned back further into his chair, the leather settling beneath him with a low, controlled sound. His eyes no longer on the contract alone but moving between the page and the people around him, recalibrating, reassessing. And for the first time since the meeting began, he was not the one in control of the moment, not completely. The chandelier light above cast a steady glow across the table, reflecting in the untouched glasses, the liquid inside them perfectly still, like the room itself had paused, suspended between decision and consequence. Ava stood where she was, just beyond the edge of the table, not stepping forward, not retreating. Her presence no longer invisible but not fully acknowledged either. Existing in that narrow space where truth had been spoken but not yet resolved. One of the executives cleared his throat softly, then stopped, as if unsure whether speaking would restore order or break something further. The attorney adjusted the contract again, slower now, more deliberate, his fingers smoothing the page as though trying to regain familiarity with something that no longer felt certain. "We should review this section more thoroughly," he said finally, his voice measured, careful, no longer carrying the authority it had moments ago. And that shift echoed through the room, subtle but undeniable. Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting back to page 17, reading it himself this time, not relying on explanation, not trusting assumption, the words unchanged, but their meaning now unmistakable. And as he read, the edges of his certainty continued to dissolve, replaced by something sharper, something more grounded, the awareness of how close he had come to making a mistake he would not have been able to undo. His fingers tapped once against the table, a quiet, controlled rhythm. The only movement he allowed. Across from him, one of the partners leaned back, avoiding direct eye contact, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful neutrality, the kind people adopt when the outcome is no longer guaranteed. The manager near the door shifted his weight, lowering his gaze, uncertain now of where authority rested, because the hierarchy in the room had changed, not visibly, not formally, but undeniably, and at the center of it all stood Ava, still composed, still silent, her role no longer defined by uniform or expectation, but by the single moment in which she chose not to disappear. Daniel's eyes lifted again, finding her once more, and this time there was no irritation, no dismissal, only a quiet recognition forming beneath the surface, not yet spoken, not yet understood fully, but present, undeniable. The space between them filled not with power or status, but with the weight of what she had prevented, and what he had nearly allowed. The room remained still, no one rushing to speak, no one eager to move forward, because the moment demanded something else now, not speed, not control, but clarity, and clarity, once introduced, had a way of changing everything. Daniel Whitmore read the clause again, slower this time, not as a formality but as a recalculation, his eyes narrowing slightly as each word settled into its true meaning, the polished language no longer smooth but sharp at the edges, revealing intent that had been carefully concealed. And as he reached the final line of the section, his hand moved, not toward the pen, but toward the page itself, pressing it flat against the table as if grounding the realization in something physical, something undeniable. This was intentional, he said quietly, not to the room, not even fully to himself, but the words carried, cutting through the stillness with a different kind of authority, one rooted not in confidence, but in clarity. The attorney across from him did not argue, did not correct, instead he lowered his gaze, a subtle shift that spoke louder than any explanation, and that was when the final piece settled into place. The deal was not just flawed, it was structured to fail on one side, his side. Daniel leaned back again, but this time the movement was different. Slower, heavier, as if absorbing the full weight of what had nearly happened, his gaze lifting from the contract and moving across the table, meeting each face in turn, measuring reactions, reading silence, and in that silence, answers revealed themselves, hesitation where there had been certainty, caution where there had been confidence, and it was enough to confirm that the risk had not been imaginary, not exaggerated, but real, carefully placed, waiting for him to overlook it. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, the rhythm gone, replaced by stillness, and then, almost as an afterthought but not really, his eyes returned to Ava, standing exactly where she had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if she had not just shifted the entire trajectory of a multimillion-dollar decision, and for a moment, nothing was said, the room holding that quiet recognition between them. Before Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. "How did you catch it?" he asked, not as a challenge this time, not as a dismissal, but as a genuine question, and the difference was unmistakable, a shift not just in tone, but in position, because now he was not above the moment, he was inside it. Ava did not rush to answer, her breath steady, her gaze calm, as if the question itself did not surprise her. "I have seen contracts like this before," she said simply. No embellishment, no need to prove anything further, the truth standing on its own, and that answer lingered, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Daniel's expression changed again, subtle but clear, the pieces aligning in a new way, the assumption he had made about her dissolving completely, replaced by something else, something closer to understanding. Across the table, one of the executives shifted uncomfortably, breaking the stillness with a small movement, as if reminded that the room was no longer operating under the same rules. The manager near the door looked down, avoiding the exchange entirely, unsure now of where attention should be placed, but Daniel did not look away, his focus remaining on Ava, steady, deliberate. And in that gaze was the beginning of something unfamiliar to him in moments like this, not control, not dominance, but recognition, quiet and undeniable, because the truth had not come from where he expected, and it had changed everything. Daniel Whitmore did not look back at the contract immediately, his attention remained on Ava, steady and unbroken, as if the rest of the room had faded into something distant, something secondary, and when he finally moved, it was not abrupt, not commanding, but deliberate, his hand sliding the document away from the center of the table, closing the space between decision and consequence with a quiet finality that needed no announcement. "We are not signing this," he said, his voice calm but absolute, and that single sentence carried more weight than anything that had been said before, the deal that had seemed inevitable now dissolving in an instant. One of the executives opened his mouth as if to object, then stopped, the words never forming. Because the authority behind Daniel's decision had changed, it was no longer based on assumption, but on awareness, and awareness did not argue, it concluded. The attorney nodded once, subdued now, already gathering the papers, already recalculating the next steps, the rhythm of the meeting shifting completely, no longer forward, but halted, redirected, the room beginning to breathe again, though unevenly, uncertain. As if adjusting to a reality that had not been expected, Daniel stood then, slowly, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound against the floor, and for a moment, no one else moved, no one interrupted, because the focus had shifted entirely, and it was no longer on the contract, but on the space between him and the woman who had changed its outcome. He stepped around the table, not with urgency, not with performance, but with intention, closing the distance that had existed since the beginning, each step measured, each movement quieter than the last, until he stood a few feet away from Ava, close enough now that ignoring her was no longer possible, not that he intended to, not anymore. The light from above softened the sharp lines of his expression, revealing something different beneath the control he had carried all evening, something less guarded, more human, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, not for authority, but for sincerity, you stopped me from making a mistake I would not have seen, he said, the word simple, direct, and for the first time, unshielded by status or position. The room behind him remained silent, no one daring to interrupt, because something else was happening now, something that did not belong to contracts or negotiations. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, without pride, without expectation, just calm, steady presence, as if this moment was not about recognition, but about truth. You would have seen it eventually, she replied, her voice soft but certain, not diminishing what had happened, but not elevating it either. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried acknowledgement, respect, and something close to humility, something unfamiliar but undeniable. He reached into his jacket pocket briefly, then paused, reconsidering, his hand lowering again without retrieving anything, because whatever this moment required, it was not a transaction, not an exchange, it was something quieter, something that could not be handed over or compensated. Instead he stepped back slightly, giving space where there had once been dismissal, and turned just enough to address the room again. But his posture had changed, the certainty still there, but no longer closed, no longer blind, and as the meeting slowly began to dissolve into low, uncertain movement, Ava remained where she was for one more second, then turned, her steps quiet against the floor as she moved away from the table, not rushed, not lingering, simply leaving the moment behind, the same way she had entered it, unnoticed at first, but now carrying something entirely different. In the silence that followed, the door to the private dining room closed softly behind Ava, and the sound seemed to linger longer than it should have, as if even the air recognized that something had shifted inside. The noise of the restaurant returning slowly, muted laughter, distant conversations, the gentle clink of glass against glass, but none of it touched her, not fully. She moved through it with quiet steps, steady and unhurried, her hands returning to the familiar rhythm of work, collecting empty trays, adjusting silverware, blending back into the world that expected nothing more from her than presence without impact. And yet something remained different, not in how others saw her, not yet, but in the space she carried within herself, calm, grounded, certain, because she had not stayed silent when it mattered, and that truth did not need recognition to exist. Back inside the room, Daniel Whitmore stood alone for a moment longer than necessary, the contract now closed, resting untouched on the table, its weight no longer hidden but understood. The executives had begun to disperse, their voices low, controlled, already shifting toward damage control, toward revised strategies, toward explanations that would make sense of what had just happened. But Daniel did not join them immediately, his gaze drifting once more to the door Ava had walked through, not with urgency, not with regret exactly, but with something quieter, something reflective, because in all his years of control, of calculated decisions and precise outcomes, this moment had not come from power, it had come from truth, and that difference settled deeper than he expected. He reached down, picking up the pen that had nearly sealed everything, holding it for a brief second before placing it back on the table with deliberate care, as if acknowledging the distance between what almost was and what now remained. Across the room, one of the attorneys approached cautiously, beginning to speak about next steps, about renegotiation, about protecting the company moving forward. But Daniel raised a hand slightly, not dismissing him, just delaying, because something else needed to settle first, something that could not be resolved through strategy or revision. His posture straightened, the familiar authority returning, but tempered now, sharpened by awareness rather than assumption. And when he finally turned away from the table, stepping toward the door, his pace was measured, not rushed, not driven, simply intentional. He paused briefly in the hallway outside, the light softer there, less defined, watching the movement of staff and guests as they passed without noticing him, the world continuing exactly as it had before, unchanged on the surface, but not for him, not anymore. Somewhere down the corridor, Ava moved between tables, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of service, unnoticed by most, but no longer invisible to him. And though he did not call out, did not interrupt, did not close the distance, his gaze remained for a moment longer, steady, thoughtful, before he turned and walked in the opposite direction, the sound of his footsteps quiet against the floor, fading into the ambient noise of the evening, leaving behind not a resolution, not a conclusion, but something more enduring,